Aloha again. This is Poka Lainui, and you are listening to Hawaiian Potpourri on radio station KWAI 1080 on your AM dial. We enter into our last half hour of this program. The time now is 5:34. You are listening to KWAI 1080 on your AM dial. If you decide that you would like to rehear these programs, especially the last, these 4 programs, you can go to my website, and it should be on the website within a week. We should have edited, and we will have it on the website. Just look for a radio show on my main page. Click on there, and I have over the last, at least the last 6 months, our numerous discussions. So you can go according to the date or according to the subject matter. Okay, we have been talking with Leon Siu, and Leon, the last article or whereas in the document that you're reading, it spoke about the self being manipulated by the United States such that only American citizens could vote. And if I may digress, and I'm sorry for digressing so often, and I know we have a large document, and it's obvious we're not going to get through the whole thing, but I think it's necessary to give some color to this discussion. Right now, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is going through a campaign to encourage people to register to vote. If you do, no vote, no grumble, that kind of idea. And I pointed out that, it's part of the historical trauma that we have suffered when we do vote or we kept away from the voting process. And whatever happens, they still steal our rights from us. So as part of that traumatic experience, we have experienced that. At the present time, even I, a Poi Hawaii, quote, native Hawaiian, am not permitted to vote in the Office of Hawaiian Affairs because of my political allegiance, which remains with the Hawaiian nation. And the Office of Hawaiian Affairs should take a more proactive role in casting that discussion, in conducting that discussion, in allowing this general discussion to take place. And so I'm challenging now the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. There was one trustee who sat and engaged in this discussion, but we'll continue with that work and raise that as an issue.
Yeah, it's a very pertinent issue because, again, who gets to vote? Who's the self to determine what's good for himself? And so as I was mentioning on our break, in recent instances, such as in the Baltic states, Estonia, I believe it was, actually filed a request for an opinion by the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, to determine whether or not this huge population of Russian soldiers and their dependents living in Estonia could vote in an Estonian vote, particularly when Estonia was voting to reestablish their nation. And so the ruling was actually very straightforward, and it says no, only Estonians, ethnic and cultural and national Estonians could vote. Nationals of other countries cannot vote in the election of another country. And so, everybody would think that's common sense, but that's exactly what happened in Hawaii. The opposite happened.
Yeah, they iced us out, who were nationals of the...
And it was even worse in Alaska in 1958. In their referendum, they actually threatened the native peoples with fines and with dire consequences if they voted. And then they paid the transmigrated population to vote. They paid $5 a person to the military to vote in this election.
So outrageous violations.
Right.
I think Kanaki, or what other people call New Caledonia, has gone through that same question. I think there was an accommodation made so that if you arrived there prior to, I think it was 1987 or some particular date, then you can vote, although you may remain French citizens. But it's very interesting that this new decision that came out by the International Court of Justice, a very telling decision.
Yeah.
Do you recall our discussion with, what was that, the committee in, was it November or December of last year? The U.S.
The UPR?
Under the... when that very question was posed to them as to
Go ahead and refresh, tell our audience about it.
I think it was Mr. Koh, K-O-H,
Right.
who said, well, it's a political decision already taken and we are not willing to review that decision again. It's as if the same argument about we being a union of states of the United States, a political decision, and somehow they try to raise some domestic principle of law to push aside the international inquiries. And I think time will, it's obvious that time will work against them because they oftentimes try to use international principles of law to stick their nose in what we might say niele, to go mind someone else's business.
That's right.
So we'll see how all of that turns out.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead, Leon.
Okay. And whereas the Charter of the United Nations at Article 73 in its declaration regarding non-self-governing territories committed administering authorities to, quote, accept as a sacred trust the obligation to promote to the utmost within the system of international peace and security established by the present charter the well-being of the inhabitants of these territories, and to this end to develop self-government, to take due account of the political aspirations of the people, and to assist them in the progressive development of their free political institutions, according to the particular circumstances of each territory and its peoples and their varying stages of advancement, end quote.
And right there is part of that heavy language that they were required as a sacred trust obligation to promote to the utmost, the people's right to self-determination. And this is what is contained in Article 73 of the United Nations Charter. The United Nations subsequently, back in 1960, passed a resolution on decolonization. And essentially it said, look, these countries are not reporting as they are supposed to under Article 73, I think it was Article 73E, and saying, therefore, we're going to pass this resolution with further details of what is required, and we're going to create this special committee on decolonization.
Now, the U.S. saw that coming, which is why they rushed through taking Hawaii and Alaska off the list in 1959, and they made it by the skin of their teeth. It was December 12th when they got the UN to remove us, and then the next year, I believe it was in January, was when this new more stringent specifications were adopted by the UN.
Yeah. If any of you in the audience would like to take a look at that document, it's a UN resolution, General Assembly Resolution 1514. And if you go through the internet and go to the United Nations resolutions and look for 1514, you will find it there. How does one argue about, as they say, the door has already been closed and you're already out of the barn, so you cannot come back in? What is the response at that point?
Well, the interesting thing is that you mentioned New Caledonia earlier, is that New Caledonia was also off the list for a while. But in 1986, they were reinstated to the list because there appeared to be some abnormalities, or that they actually did deserve to be back on the list. So the UN has experienced many times over of reinstating people or nations to the peoples and nations to the list.
Yeah, the Puerto Rican experience also, because they were taken off in when was that, 1953, I believe it was.
I think so.
And
called the South.
Yeah,
Or something.
actually, it was a Cuban representative who was sitting on the committee, on the special committee.
Miguel.
And it was Miguel.
Hmm.
And in a private conversation I had with him, he said, Poka, it was me who I brought him back to the committee.
Right. Yeah. So it's not unusual. The only thing is it's unusual because the United States is involved, and the United States is so committed and entrenched
in preventing this from coming back,
right,
in both Hawaii and Alaska. I think there's two legal principles that should be remembered. One, the special committee has said we do have competence over any situation in which you have conditions of colonization or colonial-like conditions. That's a term of art that they have used. The second point is that in the debates of the General Assembly, in the adoption of Resolution 1514, the Resolution on Decolonization, if you read the debates, it says in that debate, someone asked that question, well, what about activities that had taken place prior to our adoption of this resolution? And what came out was that what we are doing is not creating new international law or new standards, but we are merely reciting what the standards have always been back as far back as 1945, 1946. So one could not argue that the door is closed because we took a country off of the list, because the principles still exist, and so you need to apply those principles. So I think for those who have sort of shied away and said, oh shucks, we sort of dead in the water, not necessarily.
No.
Keep going.
And also the complexion of the UN has changed quite a bit since 1959. And that is, again, we've got 3/4 of the UN practically are new since 1959. And so they've gone through the process of decolonization, and many of them have gone through some really, really hard trials to get to their positions. So they're very sympathetic to nations like ours who are facing this kind of procedural blockage, or these kinds of arguments, because to them, they had to fight civil wars and sacrifice their lives in order to get where they are, and they're saying, well, it's just some stupid argument that it's politically passed, or you can't reopen that door. That's
the same Harold Koh argument they used against us.
which everybody in the room practically laughed, because it was such a specious argument.
Yeah. Which brings me back to that fantastic step that was taken when they reinscribed Kanaki on the list over the objection of the United States and France, and I'm sure Great Britain and their collection of countries who they normally get to support them. Tell me that history of how come these big nations lost the vote at the General Assembly.
Well, the thing about the General Assembly, and you probably know more about it than I do, but the thing about the General Assembly, as opposed to, say, the Security Council, is that it's one man or one country, one vote. And so it was all the small countries that ganged up and said, no, Kanaki deserves to be re-enlisted. And so that's what happened. It was because of all the small countries. And we are actually in the same situation there. And like I said, the complexion has even changed since 1986 toward our favor and against the U.S., because people are seeing that the U.S. is a conniving, manipulating entity. And, as recently as the Iraq War and these types of things, I mean, these are really, really strong violations that the world sees, and not only human rights violations, but political violations, and against the standards of the United Nations. And so since these countries cannot really express themselves in the Security Council, they will express themselves in the General Assembly.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think that's very important for people to appreciate that the United Nations have many facets to it, and oftentimes we only see what happens in the Security Council because that's where the United States has the veto power and they can take the lead, and the media reports more of what's happening at the Security Council when the the whole intent is encapsulated in the General Assembly. And it does begin in their very charter of the United Nations, nations and peoples, large and small. So they weren't going to elevate only the big ones, and they called it, at that time the term was being used was a new world order. So it wasn't George Bush the first who invented that term. They said we needed that. So it's very important that people appreciate these things that are happening in the General Assembly of the UN.
And as ponderous as the mechanism is in the United Nations, I mean, there are people who are diligently working to make things right. And so if we can find that path, and if we can put ourselves into that position, we can get a lot of assistance.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead. Continue.
The United States of America provided misleading information to the General Assembly that led the General Assembly Resolution 1469, 12 December 1959, removing Hawaii from the list of non-self-governing territories. And whereas in the 1970s, Hawaiians began to become aware that the U.S. had used deceptive, unlawful means to annex the Hawaiian Islands and had deliberately concealed the fact that the vast majority of Hawaiians were fervently opposed to annexation by the USA. And whereas the living descendants of Hawaiian Kingdom nationals have taken the initiative to advocate and organize as a body politic for the restoration of their lawful government and their sovereign nation.
So that essentially ends the whereas clauses, sort of the setup for the clauses. You know? I know that we don't have too much time. Why don't we just go into some of those? What are we really looking for? What is the result? Be it resolved.
Oh, okay. Therefore, be it resolved that we call upon the United Nations and all the specialized organizations and agencies, including the General Assembly of the United Nations and the Special Committee on Decolonization, to review the history of the Hawaiian nation and the call by the Hawaiian people and others who are the intended beneficiaries as residents of the non-self-governing territory of Hawaii, to extend to them the full right of self-determination.
Let me continue. Be it further resolved that we call upon all international organizations, nations, and peoples, large and small, and all other personalities in international affairs, to abide by the principles of the laws of nations, respecting the right of a people to self-determination, to examine the conduct of the United States of America relative to its aggression upon the sovereignty of the Hawaiian nation, resulting in the eventuality of its claim of Hawaii as a state within the Union of States of the United States of America. And
be it further resolved that we call upon the Human Rights Council to view all instruments of human rights and of fundamental freedoms, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as regards the Hawaiian people, with this special understanding of the circumstances under which we have been incorporated within the claim of a state foreign to our own, and to apply said instruments with such an understanding, and to raise these expectations upon the United States of America to respond to the members of the human rights and fundamental freedoms from which that international perspective.
And be it further resolved that we remind the international community of the United Nations definition of aggression, adopted by the UN General Assembly so as to contribute to the strengthening of international peace and security, have defined aggression as, inter alia, or among other things, the invasion or attack by the armed forces of a state of the territory of another state, or any military occupation, however temporary, resulting from such invasion or attack, or any annexation of or by the use of force of the territory of another state or part thereof. And further, that no territorial acquisition or special advantage resulting from aggression is or shall be recognized as lawful. I think that paragraph is very powerful.
It is. Because the United States is actually claiming or has actually gotten all kinds of advantages from its occupation of Hawaii, and it's all been unlawful. Common law actually states that as well, not only in international law, but common law.
So basically it says if you aggress against the government, you cannot profit from that aggression.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Be it further resolved that nothing in this definition of aggression and in the particular Article 3, and in particular Article 3, could in any way prejudice the right of self-determination, freedom, and independence as derived from the Charter of Peoples forcibly deprived of that right and referred to in the Declaration of the Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation amongst states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, particularly peoples under colonial and racist regimes or other forms of alien domination, nor the right of these peoples to struggle to that end and to seek and receive support in accordance with the principles of the Charter and in conformity with the above-mentioned declaration.
You know, and Leon, because of the time,
yes,
there was one resolved, and I'm going to ask you to move to the last one, be it further resolved. If you don't mind, let me just go ahead and read it.
Go ahead.
That cognizant that the declaration on principles of international law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states should not be construed as authorizing or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair totally or in part the territorial integrity of political unity of sovereign and independent states, conducting themselves in compliance with the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and thus possessed of a government representing the whole people belonging to the territory without distinction as to race, creed, or color. We, the undersigned, declare that the United States of America, as the administering authority of Hawaii, under a sacred obligation to bring the people of this territory to a point where they could exercise their self-determination, and having failed and refused to fulfill this obligation, and conducting itself contrary to compliance with such principles of equal rights and self-determination, call for the re-inscription of Hawaii on the list of territories to be decolonized, that the Special Committee on Decolonization send an independent investigative team to Hawaii to begin the immediate process of decolonization, to examine the progress made by the Hawaiian people to implement their right to self-determination, and to assist in the speedy resolution of the present condition of Hawaii as a non-self-governing territory to self-governance. Mm-hmm. I guess that's the heart of where we actually come into. You know, I know for some people the resolution that we have read, although concise, is kind of wordy, contains a lot of legal jargon and the rest. And I think the document itself can and should be studied by those entering into international affairs, international law. Mm-hmm. And people in the radio audience don't see it, but what we have done is underline that the particular terms here, conducting themselves in compliance with the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. I had a good friend who has passed on, John Van Dyke. On this particular point, John has always said, well, the Declaration on Principles of International Law Concerning Friendly Relations and Cooperation Among States actually stops you from asking for independence because it is against the idea of dismembering or impairing existing states. And I was adamant, and I kept telling him, John, read the whole thing. Don't leave that portion out. The United States has not been conducting themselves in compliance with the principles of equal rights and self-determination. And as a result of that, they are deprived from using that section of this declaration to prevent the removal. And, unfortunately, he has passed on. But as a matter of principle and as a matter of study, those people in the law schools right now or in the future, as they listen to this program, they come across this document, really need to pay attention to that kind of stuff.
Right.
Leon,
and what the problem was also prior was the actual accumulation of us. So when he says of the breaking up or that precludes taking the nation apart, well, they put it together wrong in the first place. So it's not a matter of taking it apart. So
yeah. I'm sorry we don't have more time. We need actually more time. I want to thank you very much
thank you so much
for being with us.
Thank you to the listeners who've stayed with us, and because it's pretty meaty stuff. But let's just let it be known that there is some very good progress being made, and this particular document is going to be significant in our quest for independence.
I will be back on the radio at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, and we can continue with this discussion. You can call in, and this will be your opportunity to engage in discussion. So let me thank all of you. Aloha, ahui ho, Leon, again, mahalo. Mahalo.
Aloha.
Kaulana nā pua o Hawaii, Kupa'a mahope o ka aina, Iki mai ka elele o ka loko ino, Pala pala anunu me ka paka. Pane mai Hawaii moku o ke ave, Koku ana honoa o Pilani, Ka ko'o mai kaua I o mano, Pa'apu me ke one o ka kuhi hewa. Aolea e kau I ka pulima, Maluna o ka pepa o ka enemi, Ho'ohui ai nā ku ai hewa, I ka pono sivila a o ke kanā.